Close your eyes. Open your mind. Welcome to Sleep Vault, where history drifts softly into dreams and knowledge seeps gently into the quiet corners of your mind. Tonight, our journey takes us far back, to the rolling fields of medieval France, to a world where faith shaped every heartbeat, where kingdoms clashed, and where the destiny of nations could hinge on the words of a single voice. This is the story of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, a peasant girl who believed she was chosen by God to save her country, a teenager who rose from obscurity to lead armies, to crown a king, and to defy both monarchs and priests. Her story is one of faith, fire, and sacrifice, a tale that has captivated the world for 6 centuries. But before Joan stood in shining armor, before she held her white banner aloft at Orléans, before her name was whispered in awe across Europe, there was simply a child, a girl born into hardship, into a world trembling under the weight of war. The year was 1412. France was bleeding. For nearly 75 years, the 100 Years' War had raged between the crowns of England and France. It was not a single war, but a long and tangled struggle, a succession of battles, sieges, treaties, and betrayals. At its heart lay a question of succession. When the French king Charles IV died in 1328, he left no direct male heir. His nephew, Edward III of England, claimed the French crown through his mother. But the French nobility rejected the idea of an English king sitting on the throne of France. They invoked the Salic law, a tradition barring inheritance through the female line, and instead chose Philip of Valois as king. This dispute lit the spark of war, and from that moment forward, the conflict seesawed across decades. Victories shifted, alliances fractured, and ordinary people bore the brunt of the suffering. By the early 15th century, France was fractured and fragile. The English had scored decisive victories, most famously at Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen devastated the French nobility. The French crown was weakened, its legitimacy questioned. And when King Charles VI descended into bouts of madness, the nation teetered on the brink of collapse. It was into this uncertain, broken world that Joan of Arc was born. Her village, Domremy, lay in the northeastern region of Lorraine, a patchwork land of fields, forests, and farmland. The people there were peasants. They worked the land, tended livestock, and endured the burdens of poverty. Life was harsh, but it moved to rhythms that were steady and familiar. The tolling of the church bell, the sowing of seeds, the harvesting of grain. Joan's parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy, were hard-working peasants of modest means. They were not destitute, but neither were they wealthy. They owned land enough to survive, and they raised their children in the Catholic faith, which framed every thought and action of the time. From her earliest days, Joan showed signs of unusual devotion. She was said to spend long hours in prayer, kneeling quietly in the village church, eyes fixed on statues of the Virgin Mary. Neighbors recalled her as kind, dutiful, and deeply pious. While other children laughed and played, Joan gravitated toward the sacred. Her seriousness set her apart. The people of Domremy lived with war always near. Bands of soldiers roamed the countryside, sometimes English, sometimes Burgundian allies of the English, sometimes French. For peasants, there was little difference. Soldiers looted, burned, and terrorized villages. More than once, Domremy's people fled into hiding to escape marauding bands. These memories of fear, of helplessness, of devastation, were imprinted upon Joan's childhood. It was in this climate, at the age of 13, that Joan began to experience visions. One day, while working in her father's garden, she claimed to hear a voice. It was accompanied, she said, by a blinding light. Startled, she looked up. Before her appeared St. Michael the Archangel. In the months that followed, the visions continued. St. Catherine of Alexandria and St. Margaret of Antioch appeared to her. They spoke with warmth, with authority, and with certainty. They told her she had been chosen by God to deliver France from her enemies, and to see the Dauphin, Charles, the rightful heir, crowned at Reims. For a 13-year-old peasant girl, the message was overwhelming. At first, she kept it secret. Who would believe her? But the voices persisted, urging her, reassuring her. Over time, her fear gave way to conviction. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that God had entrusted her with a holy mission. This belief would carry her from her quiet village to the grand halls of kings, and eventually to the battlefield. But in the beginning, her mission was met with disbelief. At 16, she traveled to Vaucouleurs, a nearby garrison loyal to Charles the Dauphin. There she sought out Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander. She told him of her visions. She declared, boldly, that God had commanded her to lead France to victory. Baudricourt laughed. How could he not? A teenage girl, illiterate, poor, claiming divine authority. He dismissed her outright. But Joan returned again and again. Her persistence impressed some of the townsfolk. They began to whisper of her holiness, her purity, her strange conviction. Eventually, even Baudricourt relented. He could not explain it, but he sensed something unusual in her. He provided her with an escort and a horse, and allowed her to travel to Chinon, where Charles the Dauphin resided. It was a journey of hundreds of miles through dangerous territory. But Joan, dressed in men's clothing for safety, traveled fearlessly. When she arrived at Chinon in 1429, Charles decided to test her. He disguised himself among his courtiers, placing another man on the throne. When Joan entered the hall, she walked straight past the false king, knelt before Charles, and addressed him as the Dauphin. The court gasped. How could she have known? Some said it was proof of divine revelation. Others whispered of trickery. But Charles himself was intrigued. In private, Joan spoke to him. What she said remains a mystery. Some claim she revealed a secret known only to him. Whatever it was, it convinced him she was extraordinary. Yet, before entrusting her with soldiers, Charles sought the church's judgment. Joan was examined by theologians at Poitiers. For weeks they questioned her. Was she mad, a heretic, a fraud? But Joan answered simply, humbly, with unwavering conviction. Her words carried a sincerity that disarmed her critics. In the end, the verdict was clear. They found no fault in her faith. She was no heretic. And so Charles did the unthinkable. He placed in Joan's hands the destiny of France. She was given armor, a sword, and most importantly, a banner. It was a white banner, emblazoned with the names of Jesus and Mary, and adorned with angels. Joan cherished it more than any weapon. She said, "I loved my banner 40 times more than my sword." With that banner in hand, Joan would march to Orléans, a city under siege by the English. And there, her legend would be born. The spring of 1429 was a season of desperation in France. The city of Orléans, perched on the banks of the Loire River, stood as the key to the kingdom. If it fell to the English, the road into the heart of France would lie open. The Dauphin's cause might crumble entirely. For months, Orléans had endured siege. The English had surrounded the city, building a ring of bastilles, fortified outposts that strangled supplies and pressed the citizens into despair. The people prayed for deliverance, but no relief came. France seemed paralyzed. And then Joan of Arc arrived. Clad in gleaming armor, carrying her white banner, she entered Orleans on April 29th, escorted by French troops. Chroniclers record the jubilation of the people. They crowded the streets, cheering, weeping, blessing the young woman they believed sent by God. Her presence was not merely military, it was spiritual. The city, which had lived in shadow for so long, suddenly blazed with hope. The French commanders, however, were wary. They were seasoned men of war, and this teenage girl, with her visions and her certainty, was a puzzle to them. Could she truly know the art of battle? Was she an inspiration or a liability? But Joan's conviction was unshakable. She insisted on action. She urged boldness, where the men had long grown cautious. She told them God had promised victory, and she believed it with such certainty that even the most skeptical began to waver. On May the 4th, the French launched an attack on one of the English bastilles surrounding Orléans. Joan rode with them, her banner fluttering high above the chaos. Though she carried a sword, she preferred not to strike with it. Instead, she stood at the front, a beacon for the soldiers, urging them forward, reminding them of God's favor. The French captured the outpost. The next day, another fell. Joan's presence turned hesitation into courage. Soldiers who had once cowered at the sight of English archers now charged with renewed ferocity. But the decisive battle came on May the 7th, at Les Tourelles, a heavily fortified English position that guarded the bridge into Orléans. The fighting was brutal. Arrows whistled through the air, stones crashed down from the walls. The French time and again were driven back. Amid the chaos, Joan was struck by an arrow that pierced her shoulder. She collapsed, and for a moment the French faltered. But Joan refused to yield. She pulled the arrow from her flesh, prayed, and mounted her horse once more. Her return electrified the army. With a cry, they surged forward again. By nightfall, Les Tourelles was captured. The English retreated. The next day, the siege was lifted. The city of Orléans was free. The people hailed Joan as their savior. Songs were sung in her honor. The Maid of Orléans, barely 17 years old, had accomplished what seasoned generals could not. For France, it was a turning point. The 100 Years' War had seemed hopeless, but now hope blazed anew. Joan's mission, however, was not complete. Her voices had told her she must see Charles crowned king at Reims. The coronation, performed in the cathedral where French kings had been anointed for centuries, was not merely ceremony. It was legitimacy. Without it, Charles was a dauphin in name only. With it, he would be God's chosen king. But Reims lay deep in territory controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies. The journey was perilous. Many urged caution. Charles himself was hesitant, but Joan pressed him. She insisted God would see them through. At last, Charles agreed. In June of 1429, the French army, led by Joan, set out on the coronation march. The campaign was astonishing. Town after town along the route opened its gates without resistance. The legend of Joan had spread. People believed she was divinely sent. Faced with her banner and her faith, many chose to submit rather than resist. At Troyes, a key Burgundian stronghold, the city at first refused entry. But Joan demanded they march forward, that they would take the city by God's will. The French prepared for battle, yet before they could strike, Troyes surrendered. Such was the power of her presence. By July, the army reached Reims. The city welcomed Charles. And on July the 17th, in the soaring cathedral, the Dauphin was anointed and crowned as Charles VII, King of France. Joan stood at his side, her banner raised high. Later, she said, it had borne the burden, and it was only right it should share in the honor. For Joan, this was the fulfillment of her mission. She had lifted the siege of Orléans. She had brought Charles to Reims, and she had seen him crowned. The will of God, as she believed it, was accomplished. Yet history was not finished with her. Her voices did not release her. They urged her onward, to drive the English fully from France to secure the kingdom for her king. And so Joan pressed forward. But now the path grew darker. Not all welcomed her rise. Among the nobility there was resentment. How could a peasant girl command such influence, while seasoned lords bent to her words? Some clergy, too, grew uneasy with her visions. Was she truly guided by saints? Or was she a danger to the Church's authority? And across the Channel, the English seethed. She had humiliated them, undermined their cause, and crowned their enemies king. To them, she was no saint, but a witch to be destroyed. Joan pressed Charles to strike at Paris, still under English control. She believed God would grant victory. In September of 1429, she led French forces to assault the city. But Paris did not yield. The walls held firm. Joan, ever at the front, was struck by a crossbow bolt to the thigh. She fell, and though she urged the attack to continue, the commanders ordered a retreat. Paris remained in enemy hands. It was Joan's first great failure, and it marked the beginning of struggles that would test her faith, her mission, and her fate. The triumph of Rheims and the coronation of Charles VII, the Maid of Orleans seemed unstoppable. Her banner had carried France from despair to glory, and her name was whispered with awe across the kingdom. But triumph, like the summer sun, is fleeting. Clouds were gathering, and Joan's path would soon turn from glory to shadow. Charles, newly crowned, should have pressed the advantage. Joan urged him to march on Paris, to drive the English out completely, to seize the moment while God's favor was so clearly with them. But Charles hesitated. He was cautious by nature, more inclined toward negotiation than bold strikes, and his advisers, powerful nobles and churchmen, feared Joan's growing influence. They counseled patience, diplomacy, and delay. Still, Joan persuaded him to attempt the assault on Paris in September of 1429. The attack was fierce. Joan herself led from the front, her banner rising above volleys of arrows and bolts. She urged her men onward, even as crossbow bolts rained down. Then a shaft struck her thigh, piercing deep. She fell, wounded, but refused to leave the field. Even as blood stained her armor, she cried out to the soldiers, pleading for them to continue the assault. But the commanders called the retreat. The gates of Paris held firm. For the first time, Joan had failed. It was a bitter blow, and worse, it gave her enemies at court an opportunity. They murmured that the maid was not infallible, that perhaps her visions were nothing more than illusions. In the months that followed, Joan continued to fight, but the momentum was slipping. Her campaigns brought only mixed success. She captured some towns, but others resisted. The fiery certainty that had carried her through Orléans now clashed with the grinding realities of war and the hesitance of her king. By early 1430, her mission turned to Compiègne, a strategic town threatened by Burgundian forces loyal to England. Joan believed it was her duty to defend it. She rode to the town, rallying the defenders, urging resistance. On May 23rd, she led a sally against the Burgundians. The French charged from the gates, striking at the enemy lines. But the tide turned quickly. The Burgundians counterattacked. French forces fell back in disorder. As Joan and her men retreated toward the safety of the gates, disaster struck. The drawbridge was raised too soon. The gates slammed shut, and Joan, with a small band of soldiers, was left outside. Surrounded, she fought desperately, swinging her sword, urging her men to hold. But numbers overwhelmed them. A Burgundian soldier pulled her from her horse. The Maid of Orleans was captured. Word spread like wildfire. France wept. The English rejoiced. At last, the figure who had crowned a king and broken a siege was in their hands. No sword or banner could save her now. The Burgundians, recognizing her value, imprisoned her at first. Joan made desperate attempts to escape. At Beaurevoir Castle, she threw herself from a 60-foot tower, hoping to break free. She survived the fall, miraculously, though bruised and shaken. When questioned, she explained that she would rather risk death than remain in captivity. Her determination, even in chains, astonished her captors. But the Burgundians were not her true enemies. They saw Joan as a prize to be sold. The English, who considered her the greatest obstacle to their claim in France, offered a ransom. 10,000 livres. And with that exchange, Joan of Arc passed into English custody. They wasted no time in securing her. She was transferred to Rouen, the stronghold of English power in France. There she was imprisoned in a stone cell, her ankles shackled, her guards men rather than women. A calculated humiliation. Unlike noble prisoners who were often afforded dignity, Joan was treated harshly. The English feared her escape, feared her legend, and they knew that killing her as a prisoner of war would not suffice. To destroy her legacy, they had to destroy her image. They had to prove she was not a saint, but a heretic, not God's messenger, but the devil's pawn. And so plans were laid. A trial would be staged, not for justice, but for condemnation. The church, or rather a faction of it loyal to England, would be the weapon. And the man, chosen to wield it, was Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais. Cauchon was no impartial judge. He owed his position to English favour, and he saw in Joan's condemnation a chance to please his masters and secure his own ambitions. The charges were many: heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy, immodesty in wearing men's clothes. Every detail of her life was to be twisted, every vision questioned, every word scrutinized. In January of 1431, the trial began. It was not held in a neutral court, but in the castle of Rouen, with English soldiers close at hand. Joan, a 19-year-old girl, stood alone before a panel of learned clerics and judges. She had no advocate, no defender, no friend at her side. Yet when she spoke, her voice carried strength. The trial of Joan of Arc was never meant to uncover truth. It was designed to condemn her. Every element was stacked against her. The judges chosen for loyalty to England, the charges drawn to trap her, the procedures twisted to deny her a fair defense. Yet even in chains, Joan did not cower. She spoke with clarity, with wit, with conviction that astonished those who heard her. Day after day she was brought before her judges. They demanded she describe her voices. Who were they? What did they say? Were they truly saints or demons in disguise? Joan answered calmly. She spoke of St. Michael, of St. Catherine, of St. Margaret. She declared with unwavering faith that they were sent by God. When pressed on whether she was in God's grace, a question meant to entrap her, for to say yes would be arrogance, and to say no would be to admit damnation. She replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The judges were stunned. It was a theologically perfect answer, beyond the reach of a peasant girl with no training. Time and again, Joan confounded them. But the court was relentless. They accused her of dressing as a man, of defying Scripture. She explained, patiently, that she wore men's clothing to protect herself among soldiers, and in prison, to guard her modesty against her male guards. Still, they returned to it, insisting it was proof of sin. They accused her of arrogance, of claiming to know God's will. She replied humbly that she was only his servant. They accused her of sorcery. She answered with prayer. The trial dragged on for months. She was shown the instruments of torture, threatened with the rack. Though the records suggest she was not physically tortured, the threat alone was cruel enough. Her captors hoped fear would break her spirit, but Joan did not yield. In May of 1431, the judges moved to their verdict. They declared her guilty of heresy. Her visions, they said, were false, her clothing sinful, her mission blasphemous. On May 24th, in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, Joan was brought before a crowd. There, beneath the shadow of the church, they read her sentence: execution by fire. Faced with the flames, exhausted after months of pressure, Joan faltered. She signed a document of abjuration, renouncing her voices, promising to wear women's clothing, submitting to the church's authority. The English rejoiced. They believed they had broken her, but Joan's spirit could not be chained. Within days, she resumed wearing men's clothing once more. Her voices returned, chastising her for her denial. She declared her mission true, her faith unbroken. To the judges, this was proof of relapse. A relapsed heretic, they said, was beyond mercy. The sentence was death. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace of Rouen. There, a wooden stake awaited her, surrounded by heaps of dry wood and kindling. A vast crowd gathered, English soldiers, townsfolk, clerics. Some came to jeer, others to weep, all to witness the end of the Maid of Orleans. Joan was 19 years old. She asked for a cross. A sympathetic English soldier fashioned one from wood, handing it to her. She clutched it tightly. She asked that a crucifix be held before her eyes as she died. Her last words, witnesses say, were prayers to Jesus. The fire was lit. Flames rose around her. She cried out, her voice carrying above the crackle of wood, calling the name of Christ again and again. Many in the crowd wept. Even her enemies were moved. One English soldier murmured, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." When the fire consumed her body, the executioners raked back the coals to show the crowd she was dead. Then they burned her remains twice more, reducing them to ash, so that no relics could be taken. The ashes were cast into the river Seine, scattered by the current. The English believed they had erased her, but in truth they had made her immortal. News of her death spread swiftly. In France, grief turned to fury. Joan had died for her king, for her country, for her faith. She had been condemned by a corrupt court, but in the hearts of the people, she was vindicated. In the years that followed, the war turned against England. The French, inspired in part by her memory, fought on with renewed determination. By 1453, the English were driven from all but Calais. France was victorious. And at the heart of that victory was the legend of Joan of Arc. Her story did not end at Rouen. In time, the church itself would revisit her trial. In 1455, at the request of her family, a retrial was ordered. Over the course of years, witnesses were called, records examined, truths uncovered. They found her original trial was corrupt, biased, political. They declared it null and void. Joan of Arc was exonerated, her name cleared, her reputation restored. Centuries later, her memory grew ever brighter. In 1909, the Church beatified her, and in 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint. The peasant girl of Domremy, burned as a heretic, was now Saint Joan of Arc, patron saint of France. Today, her story continues to inspire. She is remembered as a warrior and a martyr, a saint and a symbol of conviction. A girl who believed she was chosen by God, and who lived and died by that belief. And as you rest, let her courage and her faith drift softly through your thoughts. The story of a child, a soldier, a saint, the story of Joan of Arc. Close your eyes, open your mind, and let her memory guide you gently into dreams.